In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, it was said prosperity was measured by the thickness of the soot in the air.
Oh man, whatever them furnaces let loose, the whole sky was full of red dust. Full of red dust. If you had your wash out, you had your laundry out, it was too bad. You had to run outside and pull that laundry in because it'd be covered in red dust. You would see them coal mines lit up from Greensburg all the way to Uniontown. It was wonderful to see it.
Relentless production in Pittsburgh's steel mills, foundries, and coal mines attracted an enormous number of immigrants, and poor whites and blacks from the rural South. It was their labor which fed the furnace of industrial America.
You had to pick everything up. You had to move everything by hand. No lunch breaks of any kind. You worked and you had a sandwich in your hand. If you had to go to the restroom, boom, back right away. They timed you. Well, you get home at night, you couldn't lift your arms up. I remember this. Oh, I remember this distinctly. My father would come home and say to my mother, rub my arms a little bit, because they were picking up. There was no, it was all mule work.
I had two uncles that worked in the mill. It was dangerous. No safety precautions were in the mills. You could walk in the mill and see people with one arm, one leg. You had an accident in the mills almost every 2 days, but nobody did anything about it.
There was no compensation for the injuries and death on the job, and it was almost impossible for workers in the early part of the century to organize.
They tried to start a union, and of course they had the coal and iron police, they were called in those days. And they would bust a lot of heads, and a lot of murders were committed, and a lot of things that you daresn't say too much. If you worked in a mill, if your boss said something to you, that was it. That was the law.
Industrial work involved 6 days a week, 12 to 16 hours a day. The daily wage, barely $2. Children, too, were made to work, 2 million of them across America, some as young as 4.
They did not complain as adults tended to do. Employers liked to think of them as happy elves.
E.L. Doctorow wrote about child labor in his novel of life in the early century, Ragtime.
They were more agile than adults, but they tended in the latter hours of the day to lose a degree of efficiency. In the canneries and mills, these were the hours they were most likely to lose their fingers or have their hands mangled or their legs crushed. In the mines, they worked as sorters of coal and sometimes were smothered in the coal chutes.
As a child, in the early part of the century, Pauline Newman worked 13-hour days in a New York garment sweatshop, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory.
We had a corner on the floor that resembled a kindergarten. You were not allowed to sing. We weren't allowed to talk to each other. The door was locked to keep us in.
The locked doors would prove to be fatal. On March the 25th, 1911, fire broke out at the factory with an exit door locked on the 9th floor. Many workers jumped to their death.
I was 11, and I remember all of a sudden all of East New York went crazy because the kids were running around with the newspapers hollering extra that all these people had died in that fire.
– 146 workers died. There were no sprinklers inside the factory then. There had never been a fire drill. The tragedy outraged a public that had become increasingly aware of both the underside of a prosperous nation and the need for reform.
The great reform movement of this period is called